Chapter 18 of The Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul by Cyril Scott. When I see the name Cyril, I think Cyrus, that's C-Y-R, Cyrus. But I'm going with Cyril because I heard it said that way. The name of this title is The Departure of Justin Morward Hague. And now I reluctantly come to relate the manner in which my most precious of all friends left London for activities in another part of the world. Activities of which I cannot speak, however, for I am requested not to do so, and that reason is a sufficient one. From the first moment I met Justin Morward Hague, I regarded him as an extraordinary man. But if our meeting forcibly impressed me, our parting impressed me even more. For it showed me a side of his personality I had not perceived hitherto. From our various discussions on occult subjects, I was fully persuaded it existed. It will be remembered that the letter written to me by my sister and inserted in this book referred to Morward's extensive travels in India and elsewhere, and the wonders he had seen in that most romantic and mystic empire. And it was evident from that letter he had acquired secret knowledge over there for which only the few were ripe. And yet I recollect he remarked to me one day that it was a great mistake to suppose that initiates and adepts in occult wisdom existed only in India. As a matter of truth, there were adepts all over the world, England included. I asked him why we knew so little about them if that was the case. And I remember he smiled that indulgent and slightly amused smile of his, and replied that it usually takes a genius to fully comprehend another genius, and that only a very advanced occultist could recognize an adept when he saw one, for no person of such high attainment either advertised himself or was advertised by circumstances. Your butcher and your baker, he explained, only bow down before a king because they know he is a king. Let him but walk the streets incognito, and nobody would take any notice of him. I am personally acquainted with a man who has been alive 300 years, strange though it may seem. But as he looks more like 40 than 300, only a very few people are any the wiser when they see him. And that is just his protection, for if people really knew the truth, he would be subjected to an amount of curiosity which would render his whole life a burden and considerably hamper his highly important activities. If a man could manage to live for so long, I said, I take it he could manage to perform other miracles, so-called. He certainly could, but he doesn't, was the answer. But if he could convince humanity of some great truth by doing so, it seems to me he ought to, I urged. Again he smiled with that patient indulgence which showed he had heard my observation all too often. You are apt to confound mere belief and spirituality, he said. An exhibition of phenomena can never make people spiritual. I dare say Mr. Paderewski could play blindfold with the greatest ease, but by showing off in that manner, could he ever make an unmusical person musical? The answer is obvious. You forget that to gratify idle curiosity is to gratify one's own vanity. Would it not be extremely infradig for Paderewski to play blindfold? Hence, it is equally infradig for an adept to perform miracles, so-called. But Jesus Christ is said to have done so, I insisted. Well, the Nazarene adept never performed miracles without an adequate reason. He cured because people were ill. He materialized food because people were hungry. He calmed the tempest because his disciples were afraid. But he neither showed off nor gratified idle curiosity. Neither did another adept, Apollonius of Tyana. I asked him if anyone could acquire the necessary knowledge to work miracles. Yes and no, was his answer. Yes, because it is only essential to possess the right qualifications. No, because most people cannot be bothered to acquire them. You yourself are on the way to acquire them, and perhaps in a later incarnation you will have progressed far enough to perform miracles if you wish to do so. And you, I asked, can you materialize things? Well, you asked me a straight question, he replied, smiling, and I cannot very well tell a lie, but when I answer in the affirmative, I beg you not to mention the fact as long as I am in London. I promised absolute discretion. Of course, he went on, there is no such thing as a miracle. We of the Brotherhood merely utilize laws of nature, which most people are not acquainted with, and that is all. But why is the knowledge not given forth? I asked. Because humanity is not spiritually developed enough to use it in the right way. Give it to people who have not the necessary qualifications and they would wreck the universe almost. And the qualifications are? I asked. Perfect selflessness, perfect tolerance, complete absence of vanity, absolute self-control, and all other spiritual qualities. In a word, perfection, I said. Practically speaking, perfection, he assented. Then I'm out of the running, I observed. He laughed. You forget that you have eternity in front of you, and therefore plenty of time. But this conversation, if I remember rightly, took place a short time after I had made Marwood's acquaintance, and since then, what with the books he put in my hands, I have acquired knowledge which causes me to review the thing in a different light. All the same, I had enough curiosity to wish very ardently for a display of those powers which he admitted the possession of, and frequently I asked him to give me even the most trifling manifestation. But he always, though with great gentleness, refused. And then, at the very moment of parting, he granted my request. He had prepared me to some extent for his departure, for he told me that the time of his stay in London was drawing to a close, and that I must not expect to have him with me very much longer. As far as his physical presence was concerned, though in spirit and love we could never be separated. Well, it happened in this way. It is a habit of mine to lock my door at night, owing to the fact that I have lived for a certain period of my life in hotels. On the night in question, I had not deviated from my usual custom, retiring to bed about midnight and sleeping soundly for some 8 hours. My first dim consciousness the following morning caused me to be aware of a most exquisite perfume of roses. It seemed, in fact, that I was dreaming of roses. And then, to my great astonishment, when I opened my eyes, I found on the pillow just by my head a letter on which was placed a large red rose. My first thought was that I had left the door unlocked and that my servant had quietly entered the room. But being so unlike her to do such a thing, I began to think there must be something of deeper import in the matter. My speculations, however, were soon set at rest, for I opened the letter and began to read. And it ran, "Beloved friend, by the time you receive these few lines, I shall already be on my way to a place which for the time being must be nameless, and my life in London is now over. And for the purpose of my own development, it is essential I should retire from the outside world for a span of a few months. In future, another kind of work is allotted to me, and you and I will not be able to meet in the flesh for some time to come. Though whenever you need my help, I shall be aware of the fact and shall answer to your call. I have avoided the useless sadness of saying goodbye in person, because, my friend, I know you possess a tender heart, and I wish to spare you pain. Nevertheless, in reality, there is no such thing as the parting of souls who are truly in sympathy. For those who love one another are nearer together, though thousands of miles of material space intervene, than two beings out of sympathy living in closest proximity. Thus, in saying farewell, let us not regard it as a parting at all, since only when love and memory are dead can separation come into being. But in that this love between you and me, I now realize, can never die, having existed through many incarnations. To feel the pangs of farewell is to feel the pangs of an illusion rather than the joy of a reality. As to these last few years in which we have worked so sympathetically together, let me thank you for that sympathy which has made them so truly happy, and for that open-mindedness on your part which has rendered it possible for me to instill into you a little knowledge from the Brotherhood. For it is we who thank those who permit us to help them a stretch along the evolutionary pathway, thus giving us an opportunity of doing what we desire to do most of all things, and not they who need to thank us. For the rest, may things be always well with you, and may you live neither in the past nor the future, but ever in the serene and unchanging happiness of the great eternal. Always your devoted friend, J.M.H. P.S. Do not fail to write that occult story, and I, on my part, shall not fail to impress on you the necessary ideas. As soon as I had finished reading this letter, I went to my door and found it exactly as I had left it on going to bed, namely locked on the inside and the key in the lock. Then I realized that at last Morwood had granted my request and shown me an example of materialization. For at any rate, that is my personal interpretation of the incident, though others may endeavor to find a more mundane one regarding me as imaginative and credulous. And that ended, needless to say, my participation in the philanthropic work of Justin Morwood Haig. Although I see him from time to time in what is known as the astral body, and hence am in touch with him, yet he only appears to me when I am in need of certain instruction connected with my own psychic and spiritual development. And thus, whatever his activities may be, I am in no position to follow them. My history, therefore, has come to its natural end, and when I look back at it, and the people it attempts to depict, one fact strikes me, indeed, very forcibly, and I allude to the entirely commonplace nature of all its characters, barring, of course, the central figure himself. For their ordinariness showed me how inherently true was the essence of Morwood's philosophy, namely that a thing is tedious or pleasant according to what one brings to it oneself. Indeed, as he remarked on one occasion when he had been confronted with a particularly unbending and arid type of humanity, the more difficult a problem is, the more interesting it becomes, for no people are more difficult to deal with than the essentially ordinary ones, and that is why so large a part of his energies was spent on Pharisees and types of like nature. The poets, artists, philosophers have mentalities so receptive, he informed me, that they do not need our personal contact, and the brotherhood can impress upon their minds ideas and ideals from a far higher plane than the physical. But the man in the street is entirely different. Only by the more clumsy method of conversing with him can something be achieved. And so one of the objects of this book is to show that however jejune and commonplace the externalities of life may be, he who cares to cultivate a certain peace-inspiring point of view may shed a happiness on all around him, and by so doing bring the only true and never to be taken away happiness to his own soul.